Welcome to the 1790s. We're plunging into the 1790s today. Today's lecture, which is titled Republican Precedents and Presidents, the Placement of Power, is going to be about, surprise, early controversies about the placement of power in the first decade of national governance. And you'll see that some aspects of this are going to be continued into Thursday's lecture. Now, not surprisingly by this point, or at least I hope not surprisingly by this point, given the lectures that I've given so far, the placement of power was a core concern of the new government created by the Constitution. And let me ask, can everybody hear me well? Is life good with that? Oh, I got all of these nodding heads, thank you. So the new government under the Constitution was set to go into effect in March of 1789. And if you think about my last four lectures, we've talked a lot about power generally as we begin to move into the power of this new government. So in a sense, the revolution was a conflict over the rights and powers of British subjects. The Declaration of Independence, the second lecture, framed American rights within a larger context of human events, emphasizing that a people have certain rights, a certain power under a government, and that when those rights are violated, the fundamental compact of government is violated as well. The 1780s, last Tuesday, showed what happened after the close of the war, when states individually and taken together as a nation were grappling with the placement of power within states as they were thinking about things like new constitutions, and obviously within the nation as a whole under the Articles of Confederation. We also saw, and this will be significant for today's lecture, we also saw a week ago how the American people in the 1780s were exercising their sense of entitlement to power as well. Then last Thursday, we discussed the placement of power, the division of power within the US Constitution, the ways in which the Constitutional Convention, and indeed, again, many Americans generally, did not trust the idea of giving a great deal of power to one person, a national executive, who, in their opinion, might slip into what seemed like the default position at the time, a king. Now, we toss off the phrase checks and balances a lot without thinking about it, right? I'm assuming we all learned checks and balances, three branches of government in grade school, so it's part of our civic vocabulary. But to the framers of the Constitution, they took that balance of power seriously. The ancient world showed them precisely what happened to republics that didn't manage to balance power: anarchy or tyranny. Now, interestingly, this is part of the fun of writing new lectures. When I was preparing this lecture over the course of the last few days, I thought to myself, how did the founders use the phrase checks and balances, actually? I was talking about how we know it. How did they use it? And it does appear in the Federalist essays. But the quote that I found that was most interesting is from James Madison from 1817. And James Madison wrote this to John Adams. 1817, so he's kind of looking back a little and kind of wondering sort of how things are going. He has a little bit of perspective. So this is what Madison wrote to Adams in 1817. The great question now to be decided, and it is one in which humanity is more deeply interested than in any political experiment yet made, is whether checks and balances sufficient for the purposes of order, justice, and the general good may not be created by a proper division and distribution of power among different bodies, differently constituted, but all deriving their existence from the elective principle and bound to fidelity by the responsibility of their trusts. That's an amazing statement. He is saying basically, I've already read Hamilton saying we're deciding for all time if you can create a government from reflection and choice. Here's Madison saying, well, actually, we're kind of determining if checks and balances can work based on what he calls here an elective property, and where people stay true to it from the responsibility of their trust. That's an amazing statement. And equally remarkable, Madison went on to say that he hoped that the force of opinion or habit would preserve the importance of checks and balances over time. Sometimes you look to the founders and they tell you remarkable things that they're thinking about. And I meant to mention before, a while back, I had a letter. I don't even remember what lecture it was for, maybe the 1780s on there. It was a letter. And I meant to mention then, and I just offer this to you for those of you who think this would be fun. If you're ever interested, so I found this by going to this amazing database through the National Archives called Founders Online. And the Founders Online database has Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison. It has just all of these people, their letters and writings, word searchable. So I literally in the last 2 days said, what happens if I put in checks and balances and then look to see what came up? So that if you are out in the world and people are quoting founders at you, you can go to the Founders Online database through the National Archives and see if they really said it. It's a good thing to be able to do. People like to twist founder words all over the place. Okay, well, in today's lecture, we're going to see a kind of debate over the placement of power as the new government gets underway. And as we look at these early years of government, and basically this lecture is going to look at the first half of the 1790s. Thursday, I'll be looking at the really chaotic second half of the 1790s. As we look at these early years of the US government under the Constitution, we're going to see on a real ground level, on a human level, people wrestling with power in two main ways, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. People wrestling with the powers of a president, and people wrestling with the power of the people. Both of these things were very much in flux as the new government got underway, and in truth, in many ways, they have remained in flux to some degree forever after. Because when you consider the Constitution and what it's responsible for framing, it is a remarkably brief document. It's really a framework for a government. The assumption at the time was that once the Constitution went into effect and the government went into motion, its particulars would be worked out, its character could be determined. It was going to be, in some ways, given life while already in motion. The reality of this new experimental American nation created under the Constitution, a democratic republic, which there wasn't another of its kind in the modern world at that time, the reality of that would become somewhat grounded as it kicked in. They called it all the time in their writings experiment, the experiment in motion. So they're thinking of it that way. There were so many things yet to be determined. What would be the character of this new government and this new country? How would the ground level process of national governance work? The answers to these questions would shape the ultimate meaning and legacy of the American Revolution, as well as the nation into the future, and so people assumed. Plus, regardless of what they did, almost every decision seemed to have political meaning. Everything, particularly that the political elite were doing, established some kind of precedent, even the slightest detail, and they were very keenly aware of this. So, for example, listen to the Senate debate whether it should stand or sit when the president entered the Senate for his inauguration. He was going to head outside on the balcony and take the oath of office. So the question is, when the president comes into the Senate, what should we do? How should a presidential inauguration work? No one knew. So they started with the basics. Okay, so when the president enters the Senate, should the senators stand and treat him like a superior or sit and treat him like an equal. The risk here was making Washington look like a king or the Senate look like a House of Lords. So they debated this. And there's one, I'll mention this as well if you want to go and find it because it's quite amazing. Pennsylvania Senator William McClay, I'll be mentioning him a few times today, he wrote an amazing diary. I think he missed in his time in the Senate like 3 or 4 days total. And he wrote everything down. His dreams, the toys he bought his children, snack foods of senators. I mean, it's actually amazing. It's all in there. But because the Senate in these early years had its doors closed, McClay is in part who we owe our understanding of what was going on. So in McClay's diary, he's describing this debate about what do we do when the president enters the room. So according to McClay, one senator piped up and said, well, during the King's speech, the House of Lords sits and the House of Commons stands. Well, this seemed important. And you can almost hear when you're reading McClay's account, you can almost hear everyone in the Senate go, ah, it's a precedent. But then someone made this brilliant discovery. The House of Commons stood because they had no chairs because they were in the House of Lords. And now you can basically hear everyone in the Senate go, oh. Now, at this moment, a messenger from the House came to the door of the Senate, which raised a new question. Should he be allowed into the Senate? What was the symbolism of letting a messenger from the House onto the Senate floor? What might this mean down the road? And McClay, hearing this in his diary, writes, this is an endless business. Everything establishes a precedent. The stakes seemed very high, and there was no precise model for the new nation to follow. To get a sense of what that felt like, and I'm a historian of political culture, so a lot of what I'm interested in as a historian is the culture of the moment, and related to that, what things felt like. What was it like to be a national politician on the national stage? What were they thinking? What were they assuming? What did it feel like? So here are 3 quotes that are almost spoken or written about the same time. Here's James Madison at the launching of the new government in 1789. We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us. Here's George Washington around that same time. I walk on untrodden ground. And here's Senator McClay, roughly the same time period. The whole world is a shell and we tread on hollow ground every step. Those quotes are all spoken or written at about the same time, and they're so similar, it's almost like there was a memo. You know, use the shaky ground metaphor when you're talking about this. It so captures the feeling of really not knowing where they were going. Contingency. I say this so often in my lectures and in my teaching that people laugh when I say contingency, but it's vital. And as I said at the beginning of my lectures, it's so easy to overlook when you think about the founding period, because it's the founding. And we don't think of the fact that everything is contingent. Everything was up in the air, and political players and the populace alike knew it. The precise character of a democratic republic was unknown. Now, in many ways, the most obvious question about power as the new government got underway concerned the newly established national executive. In a world of kings, what was this new national executive supposed to be? And this is actually, I found this rummaging around online in the last few days. It's from probably an early 19th century French catalog where you could order engravings. And it's the 2 Georges, King George and George Washington. Looking at how they're depicted all by itself is fascinating, but given that I'm going to be talking a lot about George Washington trying not to be a king, this seemed like a good thing to keep in front of us. So what was this new national executive going to be? People were certainly interested, very interested, because what happened could destroy the republic almost before it started. The president wasn't a king, but that assumption left a lot of open space and possibilities. In many ways, one of the distinctive things about this first decade of governance was the ways in which Americans knew that they weren't British. They very proudly weren't British, under this new Constitution. But given that, what were they? What were they culturally? What would their political symbols or rituals look like? What the heck was a democratic republic? The figure of the national executive made this quandary obvious. On the one hand, British customs of the past had an obvious stigma after the Revolution. Americans did not want to seem too British in their habits, again, particularly considering that allowing too much British ritual or pomp to seep into American politics might corrupt the government and push it towards monarchy, which everyone assumed to be the national default. Thus, the outrage of Senator Maclay when Vice President John Adams, presiding over the Senate, referred to George Washington's inaugural address as, quote, his most gracious speech. Maclay wrote in his diary, it sounded, that phrase, his most gracious speech, sounded too monarchical. Sounded like what you say after the king's speech. And Maclay wrote, I cannot approve of this, the phrase, because of what it indicates. So British customs and culture had a stigma, given that the new government would likely slip into a monarchy sooner rather than later. Those of you reading the Hamilton documents that I've assigned for this week, pay close attention to a memo that he wrote to himself about what he thought would happen. He wrote it 10 days after the convention, what he thought would be likely to happen to the new government. It's pretty surprising. So on the one hand, they're worried about British culture and its stigma. On the other hand, some people, logically enough, thought that a little bit of British high ritual was just what a weak new government needed to establish some authority before the eyes of both the American people and the world. So in a sense, Americans were trying to Americanize British customs and rituals, which is what they knew. They were trying to be properly Republican, small r, proper for a republic, simple and straightforward and opposed to excess and too much luxury, while simultaneously somehow being authoritative and dignified, not just in the United States, but on the world stage. So along these lines, when it came to the national executive, determining what not a king looked like was challenging. And you can see this process of national definition even as early as the events surrounding Washington's inauguration. During the month of April 1789, Washington made his way slowly from Mount Vernon to New York City, celebrated every step of the way by ceremonial arches and parades and speeches and celebration. In many ways, to many people, Washington was the national government personified. As he neared New York City, he was taken on board a specially constructed barge surrounded by decorated barges and ships. And as it sailed along, 20 singers on one of those ships sang a special ode to George Washington, sung to the tune, God Save the King. Well, we know the song. I mean, God Save George Washington. I don't know what the lyrics were, but you can see people making that exact connection. Now, Washington, who was particularly self-conscious about this sort of symbolism, was always carefully negotiating between monarchical finery and Republican simplicity. He thought about it all the time. He talked about it all the time. He talked about when people would say, like, what style of dishes for the table should we get for the presidential house? And he would say something along the lines of medium, the medium style. What does that mean? We don't know, but he's trying to have some kind of compromise. As he himself explained, he aimed for simplicity of dress and everything which can tend to support propriety of character without partaking of the follies of luxury and ostentation. That's a pretty big, vague thing to do. So in a sense, Washington was the new nation's political fault line, and everyone was watching him for signs of slippage into monarchy. As Maclay put it in his diary, General Washington stands on as difficult ground as he ever has done in his life. Now, in a sense, Washington's presidency was in the midst of a process of political and cultural negotiation, really grappling with the question of what an American style of politics would be, what American understandings of presidential power would be, and as trivial as those things might sound, particularly style, the understanding that they would shape everything. So, for example, Washington during his inauguration, again, struggling for a cultural compromise. He wore a suit of plain brown broadcloth, American-made cloth, very deliberately, made in Connecticut, actually, so we can be proud about something. Yay, George Washington suit. Symbolizing his support of American manufacturers, to show he was an American leader. He's not dressed in monarchical splendor, but he also had these bright gold gilt buttons on that suit with some kind of emblem that represented the presidency. So yeah, he's a small r Republican leader. He's also an elite Virginia planter and a new national leader who needed to demand respect at home and abroad. You can see the same process of negotiation, figuring out precisely what the heck a president was, in a Senate debate in 1789, right when the government got underway over his proposed title. And again, this will show you how hard they're struggling between what they know and something new, but what they know has authority and dignity to it, and they don't know really what else to do. So a lot of the discussion over a title for the president was, what can we do that's going to compare with the titles of kings, right? How could the title president compare with titles like His Royal Highness or His Majesty? Vice President John Adams, presiding over the Senate, simply couldn't imagine it. So when someone said, President of the United States, maybe? Adams said, President of the United States. President of the United States? There are presidents of cricket clubs. What will the common people of foreign countries, what will the sailors and soldiers say? George Washington, President of the United States? They will despise him to all eternity. Following along the lines of Adams' argument, a congressional committee initially suggested the following for Washington's title. His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same. That's a title. Another contender was His Elective Majesty. They're really trying, guys. They really are trying. And since Adams was particularly eager for some kind of a grand title, after this whole episode, he was called His Rotundity behind his back. Now, Washington maintained this balance in his public appearances. Early in his presidency, he received some worried letters from people who were concerned that the fact that he regularly appeared in a cream-colored carriage drawn by 6 matching white horses and manned by liveried coachmen might seem a bit too monarchical. As one onlooker wrote to him, I see such a thing with regret. Washington's way of balancing this? A lot of days, at roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he made a very different sort of public appearance, taking a very public-minded walk around the block, stopping to look up at the clock on a church steeple, taking out his timepiece to check the time, and then walking back to his office. He was literally performing normalness, right? He's not a king in a carriage. Look at me, I'm walking in the mud in the street like everybody else. It's a seemingly trivial gesture, but he got fan mail about it. People understood what he was saying. Not a king. Look at me, I'm in the street like everybody else. So particularly fellow Virginia gentlemen understood the sacrifice of giving up his grand horses and equipage. As basically, he got letters from Virginia gentlemen saying, the daily walk, great move, good point. You can see George Washington's self-consciousness about this and the degree to which this was all in formation in something as simple as Washington's copy of the Constitution. And here's where I would love the second slide. Okay, this, and I find this moving, so I just wanted to share it with you. This is Washington's copy of the Constitution. And he went through it, and you can see how he's bracketed it and written president. He went through the Constitution to carefully figure out what his job was. I find that remarkable and kind of touching in its own way. It's a reminder of how nothing is decided here. It's like, what exactly do I do? Oh, here's another part where the president does something. My point here is that defining the president, limiting in addition to defining presidential power, was central to the founding period. And people were feelingly aware of what that meant. Now, of course, there was another side to George Washington that was not so publicly obvious, but that needs to be mentioned. The Virginia planter side of George Washington, who was most certainly present in the national capital, but not on display. As much as Washington was trying to embody whatever a Republican national executive was supposed to be, he was a wealthy plantation owner who wanted to protect his wealth as held in the people he enslaved. And you can see this in the way he handled the enslaved people that he brought with him to the national capital. When the national capital moved from New York City to Philadelphia in 1790, Washington realized that the 8 enslaved people in his presidential household might take advantage of Pennsylvania's emancipation law. That law allowed enslaved people to claim their freedom after 6 months of residence in Pennsylvania. To evade that statute, the Washingtons sent their enslaved cook, waiters, and maids out of Pennsylvania every 6 months. As Washington explained in this letter to his longtime secretary, Tobias Lear, in 1791, if upon taking good advice it is found expedient to send them, his enslaved servants, back to Virginia, I wish to have it accomplished under the pretext that may deceive both them and the public. Right? I don't want anyone to know. He didn't want the enslaved people to know this is what was happening either, in case they might get ideas and actually try to run away. And he comes up with this idea. No method might be so effective as the fact that Mrs. Washington is going to Virginia next month, toward the middle or latter end of it, and she can accomplish this, basically take enslaved people with her when she goes back to Mount Vernon, and then lo and behold, poof, the 6 months will be ended and they can come back and start a new 6 months. So Washington is playing a part on the national stage, living up to his political responsibilities as a Republican leader, whatever that was, trying to maintain the balance of America's non-monarchical Republican government, and really carefully protecting his investment in enslaved people at the same time. He was president of the United States and an invested elite Virginia planter behind the scenes. And in a way, that's kind of a perfect encapsulation of the inherent conflicts in American ideals versus realities from the nation's start. Another kind of display that Washington used as president to demonstrate that he was not a monarch moves us on to a second question about the placement of power, and that's the power of the people. This also comes from Maclay. So supposedly, shortly after arriving in New York City to assume the presidency, Washington decided to personally visit every congressman in person to demonstrate his respect for the people's branch of government. Right? Once again, look at me, I'm not a king. I'm going to visit every member of Congress. So these visits were so symbolic that, as Maclay writes in his diary, he barely walked through the doors of the boarding houses that he was visiting. Maclay says Washington rode up to his boarding house, got off his horse, said good day, made 2 complacent bows, got back on his horse and left. That is a symbolic visit. But obviously, he's really trying to make a point. He was literally bowing to the people's branch and, in a sense, the people. We're going to continue to see on Thursday the power and place of the American people in America's new form of government, and how that was not maybe just but the central issue of this first decade of government. How democratic was this new nation supposed to be? The founding generation knew that their new constitutional government was grounded on the will of the people, on public opinion, in a manner unlike most other modern polities, monarchies. For the founders, this was a very self-conscious debate. This is part of what I love about this period, that these politicians were self-consciously thinking about public opinion, talking about it in their letters, worrying about it in the course of their daily business. When you read their correspondence, you can see them wondering, okay, public opinion, really important in a republic. Who is the public? How do we find out what the public is thinking? How do we get to the public? Great idea. What does this mean? How do we make it operate? Were politicians supposed to appeal to only the thinking public or to every citizen who could vote? And we'll see on Thursday, many people in this period, particularly the elite, had very strong feelings about this, but they're thinking about it all the time. Now, as 21st century onlookers, I actually wrote in my notes here, 20th century onlookers. I am old. As 21st century onlookers, we are so used to the idea of public opinion. We assume so readily that it can be quantified with polls and questionnaires that we forget that it is an artificial construct, something that had only the vaguest of meanings in the late 18th century, a somewhat frightening force that seemed to potentially hold the seeds of social revolution. And the American people had that same knowledge, because don't forget, Americans of all kinds had experienced firsthand the enormous power of an engaged and active citizenry during the revolution. Indeed, what is a revolution but an expression of public sentiment by a people who have been kept from expressing their will and demands? America's elite recognized the centrality of public opinion, but the reality of that idea was very different from understanding it ideologically. We're going to see, as I said, more on Thursday, that one of the main dividing issues between Federalists, essentially the Hamilton team, and Republicans, the Jefferson and Madison team, was their comfort level with an engaged and involved populace on an ongoing basis. Federalists thought that the people should vote in elections and then basically step out of the way and let their betters govern. And if they didn't like what happened, another election would come along and they could assert their will that way. Republicans were far friendlier to more public engagement and, I'll talk about this Thursday as well, much better at communicating with an engaged public. Though this isn't to say that elite Republicans themselves didn't have some issues about status, but still, Republicans were better at it, more comfortable with it, and felt more compelled to do it. You can feel the disdain of some Federalists towards the public in the way that they collected public opinion, connecting with the public, sort of. Politicians of all kinds were constantly asking friends back home or in other states, can you get for me a sense of public sentiment? Can you figure out what people are thinking? Can you listen in? It doesn't just mean like what my 5 friends think. They really wanted a sense of what some public, who knows what public, was thinking about the government. Can you listen to what they're saying? Maybe look to see what newspapers they're reading? So Federalists did this with a certain Federalist flair, as you'll hear. A Federalist in Massachusetts named Henry Van Schack tried to collect public opinion for his friend, Massachusetts Senator Theodore Sedgwick. And as Van Schack explained in a 1796 letter to Sedgwick, and he's saying this with like disdain dripping from his words, "You know I am one of the people. And always when there is political matter of importance on foot, I mingle with the yeomanry of the country in bar rooms." Just dripping. Now, he was actually lingering in bar rooms because he was just listening to hear what people had to say in bars, right? I'll collect public opinion this way. Over a year later, Van Schack was still lingering. He wrote to Sedgwick, "I continue my bar room visits once or twice a week." Now, in New England Puritan tradition, Van Schack made sure to tell Sedgwick he was not drinking in those bar rooms. He said, "You know I am no grog drinker, hence you will conclude that my motives for mingling upon the footing with those who profess liberty and equality are of another sort." Federalist flair. So Van Schack and Sedgwick were Federalists, very wary about the public getting too powerful. Now there's a great event that happens. It's a great example of what I'm talking about here. The elite, and in particular Federalists, assuming a certain kind of power and status. the American people, partly growing out of the Revolution, as we saw in the 1780s, but also growing throughout this period, having a very strong sense of what they're entitled to and what their rights are and their ability to voice what they were feeling. I talk about this episode a lot in my teaching because it's like if I invented something to show a ground level example of Federalists and the public arguing about who had more status and how it should be displayed, this is what I would invent. So it takes place in July of 1795. Not long before this, the Jay Treaty with Great Britain had gone into effect, and a lot of people, particularly Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, thought that it was too soft on the British. So remember that, again, next time, Republicans are France-friendly and Federalists are England-friendly. So the Jay Treaty to Republicans seems too soft on England. So in New York City, handbills and newspaper notices were posted for days, inviting the public to gather in front of Federal Hall in New York City on a specific date at a specific time and to protest against the treaty. And ultimately, there were supposedly hundreds of people gathered in front of Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan, which at that point was the middle of Manhattan. Some elite Federalists were also present due to the last-minute efforts of Alexander Hamilton and some Federalist friends who approved of the treaty and wanted to persuade the public to like it, and decided to do that in person. So the Republican protest was to start at noon. At the stroke of 12, Hamilton, surrounded by a few high-ranking Federalists, climbed onto a stoop and began to address the crowd. He had barely spoken one sentence when the crowd erupted in protest, demanding a chairman to turn Hamilton's interruption into an organized debate. Okay, first of all by itself, that's fascinating, right? There's a protest. Hamilton steps up and says, "I have something to say." And the crowd says, "Oh, well, if you have something to say, then we need to have a debate. Who wants to be chairman?" That's an amazing crowd, right? That in and of itself is a remarkable thing. So the crowd nominates and appoints a chairman. The chairman says, "We're going to give a Republican the first chance to speak." And as soon as this Republican opens his mouth, Hamilton interrupts. Not surprising from Hamilton. The chairman puts this question of order to the crowd. The crowd votes. Again, think about what this crowd is doing. It's a big crowd of people, and they're very much engaged in organized, orderly political debate. The crowd votes. They want to hear the Republican first. So again, the Republican tries to speak, but now, at this point, the crowd is in confusion. Assuming that the Federalists were trying to silence him, the Republican invited people who disapproved of the treaty to move with him to the right. So a throng of people surged to the right, leaving Hamilton standing before a somewhat smaller crowd of assembled citizens. So again, Hamilton tries to address the crowd, says, "You know what? I want to fully discuss the treaty. I will talk about the whole treaty. I will go phrase by phrase through the treaty with you." And again, he is silenced by what one newspaper wonderfully described as, quote, "hissings, coughings, and hootings." Totally, you can hear it. Someone from the crowd, and here's another remarkable crowd moment. At this point, someone from the crowd yells, "The text of the treaty has been in newspapers. We've read it. We don't need you to explain it to us. We know what's in it." Again, pretty fascinating crowd saying a lot about their assumptions about what they're entitled to and their rights. Okay, so now, realizing that the crowd would never let him speak, Hamilton asks the chairman, like, "Okay, I can't say anything. Mr. Chairman, I brought a resolution with me. Would you please read my resolution aloud to the crowd?" So the chairman takes Hamilton's paper and begins to read, and as a contemporary newspaper report explained, behold, a momentary silence took place. But when the citizens found that the resolution declared it unnecessary for people to give an opinion on a treaty, they roared as with one voice, "We'll hear no more of it, rip it up." Now, I want to pause here. Hamilton gets up in front of a crowd of people and says, "What you think about treaties doesn't matter, people. It's a treaty." Like, really? Why are we even standing here? And says that to the crowd. Not surprisingly, at this point, someone in the crowd throws a rock and it hits Hamilton in the head. Hamilton calls out, "Friends of order, follow me." And he and like two other Federalists sort of creep away. By later that afternoon, and in my research, I'm the first person that put these things together. Hamilton was involved in 10 affairs of honor before his final fatal duel with Burr. 2 of them are this afternoon. By later that afternoon, he's mortified, he storms off. He challenged 2 men to duels in the streets of New York City after this happened to defend his reputation as a public man. None of those duels happened, but still, 2 duels in a day might be a record. Okay, clearly, this crowd of people perceived themselves as part of the political process, not as interlopers who were simply shouting words of protest. They were exercising their rights and opinions as they felt entitled to do. I mean, I love you don't have to explain this to us. We've read it. It's in the newspaper. Hamilton at one point even offered, after this whole episode with The Rock, he says, maybe if I go and knock on people's doors one by one and explain it to them, they'll like it better. He's like breaking the public down into person by person, right? He is not ready to confront the public. So clearly this crowd perceives themselves as part of the political process. In a sense, the rally that I just described was actually a contest in which Hamilton and the crowd were debating the proper role of public opinion in the political process. You can see how personal and immediate this debate is, not just to Hamilton, but to everyone engaged in it. And of course, in Hamilton's case, you can see how it affected his sense of status and his sense of himself as a leader, which was also wrapped up in democracy, right? The more power, the more democratic the nation is, the more certain elite leaders are going to feel like everything is being stolen from them in some way or another. So as you can see, this process of democratic self-definition, of beginning to determine how democratic a republic was supposed to be, was not an elite conversation between 5 men in a room. It was a national conversation, and a complex one at that involved not only politics and political institutions, but also social issues, the nature of American society, and even the tone and character and culture of the new nation. This is a really vital thing to remember throughout this period, and it's going to come up again. Political, cultural, and social issues were intertwined in this period in a very self-conscious way. Everything was kind of intertwined. In this period, and I guess Thursday is when this will come up as well, in this period, people couldn't untangle domestic affairs from foreign affairs. It was one big bundle. They couldn't pull them apart, particularly in a new nation. It was all one. There's a James Madison quote from this period in which he says something like, in truth, all of our political issues are economic, and all the economic ones are social, and all the social ones are cultural. It's just one big tangle of who are we? National politicians knew that their decisions could have an impact on all of those levels, and in a different kind of a way, the public knows the same thing. And the end result could make or break the nation, could make it in different ways, or could break it. People who argued for things like high-flown honorary titles or no public opinion on a treaty were promoting a certain vision of the republic, potentially affecting the political structure of the government as well as the tone and character of the nation as well. In essence, the new republic was engaged in an ongoing process of national self-definition from its very start. And here at its beginnings, we see the new nation wrestling with a question, which is one question at the heart of this lecture. What is this new government, and where did it place power? Now, on Thursday, we're going to see a lot come to a head. The late 1790s were branded by Thomas Jefferson as the reign of witches, because they're an era when the Federalists really had control. And yes, he was making a slap at New England. It's like, those Federalists, they're all from New England. It's the reign of witches. Really not a fan of Federalists. But he's saying something deeper, which is what we're going to be talking about. The Federalists become more extreme in the late 1790s. The world stage begins to intervene. And increasingly, this becomes a really blatant, open battle about how democratic this nation should be. You get things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, which people very much recognize what they are, attempts to silence people. You get all kinds of extreme measures in the late 1790s that raise all kinds of questions about what this nation will be. The presidential election of 1800, as we'll hear on Thursday, people understood that all of this in some way was bound up in that election. They felt that in one way or another, that election was going to help determine how democratic the nation was going to drift, and people felt that Jefferson and his side were more democratic, and Federalists of Alien and Sedition Act fame less democratic. So that election had huge repercussions. It's an amazing, amazing election that almost came to violence, and the Federalists were going to prevent an election from happening. So it's actually, comparatively speaking, really interesting. So at any rate, on Thursday, we will see how the things that I'm talking about now, the themes that I'm talking about now, are going to evolve. Jefferson ultimately calls his election in 1800 the Revolution of 1800. He's not shy, Thomas Jefferson. John Adams' response to that, another thing I'll recommend to you. The letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson when they're ex-presidents are amazing. And what I'm talking about now comes from those letters. You can find them in Founders Online. Jefferson, there's a letter published out in the world. Jefferson doesn't publish it, but as they get older, their letters are beginning to be published. And one of them, Jefferson declares his election, the Revolution of 1800, as real a revolution as the first revolution. And John Adams reads this and responds in a letter to Jefferson saying, really? I think if we had put you and Burr in a bag and shook it up and one popped out, it would have been the same election. That wasn't a revolution at all. So Adams really guns for trouble with Jefferson in those later letters. Jefferson is like, let us talk about the Greeks. He just steps away from all controversy. But at any rate, what you can see, and this gets back to what I started out saying at the beginning of the lecture, even as late as 1817, Madison, in that quote that I offered, they understand the larger debate at play here. They're making all kinds of claims, and you can decide for yourself on Thursday whether the election of 1800 was as real a revolution as the first one. But what we're talking about again and again and again here in the 1790s really is how democratic is this nation going to be? And I mentioned in my first lecture, democracy and democratic mean something different in this time period. It's important to remember that. But words that we take for granted, ideas that we take for granted, like checks and balances, you really have to get down on the ground and wrestle with what the people in this period think they mean and what it means for them to support or oppose it. I will stop there, and I will be back on Thursday.